allowed to cross the border, the fact is that people have crossed it and they are living in the forests. There hasn't been any formal or official help either for those people or for the residents of the area. And so that's created this terrible situation where local people are seeking to rescue people from literally starving to death or freezing to death in the cold forest. So they behaved also not well. Again, had they internationalized the response from the beginning, had they asked for help from the EU, had they begun negotiating or talking about it with other democracies 2 months ago, we might be in a different place now. But they also refused to do that precisely because they saw this as a way to make some kind of politics out of the crisis.
Although I suppose the element to that is, if they did talk to the rest of the EU, isn't there, when you look around the EU, so much nervousness now about the question of migrants and what to do with them that they might not have had a particularly sympathetic response?
No, they would have had a sympathetic response. I mean, I've spoken to people in the EU who offered them help of various kinds. The EU has its own border service, which could have helped deal with the situation. It has kind of emergency asylum processing teams. They could have begun to process people who had some legitimate claim to asylum or even an emergency way. And as I said, just the EU negotiating seems to already have been more effective than Poland seeking to turn this into a pseudo-military conflict.
Turning the conversation back to Mr. Lukashenko, you've recently written a piece when you say the bad guys are winning around the world. I don't doubt that he was one of the bad guys that you were thinking of. Indeed, you referred to him. What are you getting at?
This was a cover story that I did for the December issue of The Atlantic magazine, and it's an argument about the nature of modern autocracy. Why is Lukashenko still in power? He's somebody who's been a poor leader. His country is not in good shape economically. He has a very large and articulate democratic opposition. But he manages to stay in power mostly through the backing of his neighbor, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, but also because he has large Chinese investments in his country. He does economic deals with Iran. He has Cuba to defend him at the UN and elsewhere. These are different countries with very different geographies and different ideologies. You know, they call themselves communist or nationalist or even theocratic, as the Iranians do. And yet nowadays they're much more willing to help one another push back against sanctions, push back against human rights violations, allegations. They're willing to come to one another's aid. And the West hasn't really, or really the democratic world, the West is probably an outdated term for it, but the democratic world has not come up yet with a way to respond to these new kinds of overt provocations. Whether it's the Russians murdering people in the UK or in Germany, whether it's Lukashenko hijacking a plane, as he did a few months ago, and forcing it to the ground in order to arrest a dissident off of it. These kinds of actions are becoming more common. These are the autocrats reaching across their borders, and they support one another in doing this. So the nature of autocracy has changed, and I don't think the democracies have yet really caught up with it.
They tend to go for sanctions in those circumstances, don't they? Are you saying that simply doesn't work?
It's just insufficient, particularly given how often sanctions are somehow, they're a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Something happens and then we come up with some new sanctions. I mean, shouldn't this be more strategic? Shouldn't we have a plan for sanctions? Shouldn't we ask whether these are countries we really want to be doing business with at all, given that they are seeking to disrupt us and destabilize us, and in some cases interfere very blatantly in our politics? As I said, I just don't think there's a strategy yet for thinking about this as a long-term major problem that's going to face the democratic world for some time to come.
The American journalist and historian Anne Applebaum, her premise is that autocrats seem to be winning the battle with the rest of the world. A good one for both Helena and Mark to consider. Helena, what do you say to her premise?
Well, what struck me most about Anne's very interesting article is really, it's sad to say, but how far shamelessness and nihilism will get you in life. And I think Anne was talking about the fact that autocracy doesn't happen in isolation. It doesn't happen in one country, but they prop each other up, they help each other, and they're also influencing the international conversation. Dissidents who flee their country are still not necessarily safe abroad. And when you no longer, this idea of the Western world, the democratic work of, you just have to show who these people are and then they will lose the argument. That sadly is no longer true, because Lukashenko doesn't care. He has no shame about the things he's doing. He said on the BBC the other day, "We will massacre the scum." I mean, so the idea that all you have to do is reveal what these people are doing and then they're going to lose the argument, that's no longer true.
Mark, Kirsten, what did you take out of Anne Applebaum's conversation, especially that point about whether sanctions still work and how they ought to be better organised?
Yeah, I mean, sanctions are always a difficult subject because of how, you have to leave room to have more because you're trying to deter someone, but you're also trying to give them the opportunity to change their behavior. But what really struck me is, Lukashenko and Putin are acting like the dictators and despots that they are. But Poland's supposed to be, a liberal democracy. And, if we zoom out a little bit, the ruling government since at least 2015 has been talking in terms of xenophobia and anti-migrant and anti-refugee rhetoric as if it was, political sport. The attitude towards migrants is simply horrific. And, international human rights law and refugee law, you mentioned how migrants who do get into Poland are pushed back, which is illegal. We shouldn't let liberal democracies treat these legal regimes that they're part of, as if they're a la carte, and they can just choose which bits and pieces they want, and they can claim that migrants are illegal for crossing borders. Migrants aren't illegal for crossing borders, even when they're not legally allowed to cross those borders. There are clear obligations that states have towards asylum seekers. You can't just seal off borders. You can't just claim that migrants in whole are terrorists or illegal. There are clear obligations. And this attitude isn't just like a side issue right now. It's a core part of the problem that many states, including Poland, have towards refugees.
Which may in part be pushed because of the views of the wider electorate who put those particular governments in place, of course.
Yeah, so, and this is a deeply troubling trend, and Poland certainly isn't alone in this. You look at the United States, you look at other countries, you look at the European Union and its attitude towards migrants on the Mediterranean. And of course, this anti-migrant, this anti-refugee sentiment simply has a lot of political purchase. What I'm worried about is liberal democracies playing down to dictatorship tactics and to autocratic tactics when it comes to refugees, as opposed to playing up to the liberal and democratic values that they're supposed to stand for. I think this is a deeply troubling trend. I think it's maybe the underlying theme of Anna Applebaum's piece, and I think this needs to be addressed as opposed to constantly, again, going back to this, that this is actually ends up being about geopolitical macho man brakemanship. Again, there's a human face to these issues. There need to be human responses to them, and liberal democracies have a very core responsibility in playing up to the values that they are based on. And I'm very concerned, and I think we should all be, that many of them are abandoning them, especially to vulnerable people like refugees and migrants.
Thought, if you're listening and want to offer your thoughts. We're going to end with a new play this week here in London. A new play by a new author in a small theatre venue brought audiences to tears with a story of love and loss among lovers and friends who lived 30 years ago in a faraway country that no longer exists. The Bosnian-born Igor Memic won a writing prize here in the UK for his play Old Bridge. It's set in Mostar in the year 1992, as the devastating war that ultimately led to the breakup of Yugoslavia came to town and ruined everything, including its pride and glory, the 16th century old Ottoman bridge, the Old Bridge, Stari Most. Well, in this essay for Weekend, he describes how recent talk of a return of conflict in Bosnia has ruined his hopes of laying his past to rest with this play.
Every summer when I fly back to my home, I hear the disbelief in my friends' voices as they lay their eyes on Mostar for the very first time. It looks like a fairy tale. That's what they tell me. And they're not wrong. How could a place like this not move you to poetry? Church bells ring out over the city's cobbled streets as the melisma of the call to prayer weaves seamlessly through each reverberation. Two musicians in the same orchestra, neither louder than the other as they play their instruments in perfect harmony. Past the Austro-Hungarian bathhouses, the Ottoman caravanserai and the socialist spomeniques in their perfect concrete symmetry. The hammer of a bearded coppersmith joins the cavalcade of voices as he strikes a gentle repoussé onto the e-brick before him. Damier trousers clad in amber and burgundy hang beneath his faded AC/DC t-shirt. The coffee shops on either side of him pack tight with locals as they ponder Mostar's age-old question. a Turkish kahwa, or an Italian espresso. No need to rush. In this city, time stands still. What a perfect place to have a war. What fertile ground to sow division and resentment, because those coffees that we sipped together side by side for centuries are now cause enough to hate each other. Why? Because some politicians told us so. The only war in human history that every side lost. And the world just sat back and watched. The country once celebrated as socialism's success story now gave prominence to the world's new favorite phrase. Ethnic cleansing. It sounds so palatable, like nuclear umbrella or collateral damage. Nothing to worry about here, just a spot of ethnic cleansing, a little spring cleaning of the races, don't mind us. And you certainly didn't. So, how do you forgive someone who isn't sorry? How do you forgive those who sterilized my home and those who let it happen? It's a question I've carried on my shoulders for precisely my entire life, and I answered it the only way I could. Old Bridge was my excavation, my attempt at healing old wounds, because I knew that if I could move an audience to laughter and tears for these two lovers, for these four friends, then if the worst should ever come to pass again, you could be moved to action instead. But never.
Cabinet of technocrats. State media in China have released video of the tennis star Peng Shuai at a junior tournament in Beijing. She went missing earlier this month, having accused a senior politician of sexual assault. But the Women's Tennis Association says that the footage doesn't address concerns about her safety. In the Netherlands, rioters have taken to the streets for a second night over coronavirus restrictions. In The Hague, protesters lit fires and threw stones and fireworks at the police. Officers attempted to restore order with horses, dogs and batons. There were also disturbances in other towns. The British government is launching a review into the possibility of racial bias in the design and use of medical devices. Some research has suggested that patients from ethnic minority backgrounds are at greater risk of receiving inaccurate results from devices that measure levels of oxygen in the blood. Bulgarians are voting today in a runoff presidential election. The anti-corruption incumbent, Rumen Radev, narrowly missed winning outright in the first round and is tipped to be re-elected. He's standing against a candidate who has the support of the Conservatives. China has downgraded diplomatic relations with Lithuania in a dispute over Taiwan. It's lowering its representation from ambassador to chargé d'affaires. And in Japan, the death's been reported of the Oscar-winning costume designer Emi Wada. She was 84. BBC News.
Wars, the oppression of people, colonialism, they leave their mark, not just on nations and peoples, but on the food we eat.
I always tell people, when they eat Cape Malay food, they'll put the food into their mouth and they'll get all these warm, wonderful, spicy flavors. No chili in it though. And then they'll swallow it, and as they swallow it and reaches their bellies, their toes start curling in absolute pleasure. That's Cape Malay cuisine. Did you get that?
This is what happens when you mix Dutch and Indonesian food in South Africa. A 300-year-old culture clash born out of colonialists and their slaves. And what happens when Vietnamese and Cajun taste collide in Texas?
They would improvise by adding these flavors to the Cajun crawfish. So it would be this just beautiful, luscious butter garlic sauces that you would, suck and lick your fingers, and it became quite addictive.
I'm Ruth Alexander, and in this episode of The Food Chain from the BBC World Service, we're going to explore how two intriguing new cuisines were born in South Africa and the United States. How history's darkest episodes can lead to some of the most captivating flavour combinations. Oh, and why some people will cringe when I call them fusion foods. My guide to one of South Africa's oldest fusion foods is the indomitable cookery writer and restaurateur Cass Abrahams.
Then I'm an old lady, because I'm almost 80.
Her dogged research and, in her own words, big mouth, have helped bring Cape Malay cooking out of the shadows.
The word Cape Malay doesn't have anything to do with Malaysia. It does, however, have a very significant part in the language of Bahasa Melayu.
Bahasa Melayu is spoken in Indonesia and surrounding countries.
So people who spoke Bahasa Melayu were called Malays. And these Malays were brought to South Africa by the Dutch settlers as slaves
in the 17th century. So the word Cape refers to the area at the southern tip of South Africa, where Cape Town is, and Malay to the enslaved Muslims who were sent there from the east by Dutch colonizers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because to understand the rich cultural history of Cape Malay food, we need to know that before the Malays and before the Dutch, there was already a mix of people in the area, the indigenous San and Khoisan tribes, and before the Dutch took charge of the Cape, Portuguese colonialists.
They didn't last long because they irritated the chiefs of the indigenous people and they drove them out. But they left a little bit of heritage behind.
In apartheid South Africa, Cape Malay food had become so obscure, she says, that people didn't even know that bobotie, the national dish of beef, apricots, nuts and chutney, had its roots in Cape Malay cookery. But once out in the open again, she says the traditional cuisine had a role in helping foster greater understanding between people once on different sides of the racial divide.
It did help. It did help a great deal. You know, we have the Afrikaner farmers and their wives. You know, the wives on the Farmers' Wives Association. You'd have small little gatherings all over the country of the farmers' wives. And they were the most hardened of apartheid. Should I put it this way? They were very prejudiced. You know, I encountered a lot of predators when I started off. And they would come together for a meeting and then invite me to give a talk. And I would give a demonstration, food demonstration, and talk about the culture. And then show them how close their cuisine was to our cuisine. Because the Dutch learned that food and took it around South Africa with them. So you still find people on farms cooking the same food that they cooked many years back. That gave me a foot to get in and work with people's minds, yeah.
For all its rich and troubled history, Cass Abrahams says Cape Malay cooking is not just a story about the past. She says her daughter Shakira, who joined us on the call, is taking it in new directions with her market food company, Spicy Cape Cuisine.
My daughter does the most wonderful thing. She takes that flavor of the cuisine and she creates new dishes.
So what I'm trying to do is take recipes that I've grown up with, recipes from my mom, and make them plant-based. Something like a bobotie, I've veganized. For example, pickled fish, which is traditional on Easter and very widely eaten, you can absolutely replicate using cauliflower.
And Cass, what do you think about this Cape Malay cooking but without the meat?
I think it's brilliant because I love vegetables and I also am very concerned about sustainability. My husband, however, is not very keen on that. But they've got to change with the time. They all have to change. Yeah.
What do you think of your mum's legacy?
It was almost as if South Africans, or maybe Cape Malay people, were inherently almost ashamed of the heritage and the legacy and everything. And now people are embracing it more, they're being more proud, and I think my mother's got a lot to do with that. I think that's the reason that there are these amazing restaurants all over South Africa that are using traditional flavors and elevating them to almost Michelin star standards, but they're true to the original, they're true to the history, and I think a lot of that is